It enters into existence only at that point where its pure knowledge about itself is the antithesis and alternation of its dual aspect. Aware that its pure knowledge is an abstract essence, absolute spirit, is this conscious duty an absolute antithesis to the knowledge that is conscious of itself, qua absolute individuality of self as essence. The former is the pure continuity of the universal, which is aware that the individuality which is conscious of itself as essence is intrinsically a nullity, is evil. This, however, is the absolute discreteness which is conscious of itself in its pure oneness as absolute, and of the universal as something unreal, which exists only for someone else. Both aspects are purified into the unity in which there is no longer in them any existence devoid of self, any negative of consciousness, where, on the contrary, duty is the unchanging identical character of its self-knowledge, and evil equally has its purpose in its being within itself and its actuality in its utterance. The content of this utterance is the substance of its enduring existence. It is the assurance of spirit's immanent self-certainty. Each of these two self-certain spirits has no other purpose than its own pure self and no other reality and existence than just this pure self. But yet they are different, and the difference is absolute because it is set in this element of the pure notion. It is also absolute not only for us, but for the notions themselves which stand in this antithesis. For these notions, though specific in relation to one another, are at the same time in themselves universal, so that they fill out the whole range of the self, and this self has no other content than this, its own determinateness, which neither goes beyond the self nor is more restricted than it. For one of them, the absolute universal, is equally the pure knowledge of itself, as the other is the absolute discreteness of individuality, and both are only this pure self-knowledge. Both determinatenesses are thus pure conscious notions whose determinateness is itself immediately a knowing, or whose relationship in antithesis is the I. Consequently, they are these sheer opposites for one another. It is the completely inner being which thus confronts its own self and enters into outer existence. They constitute pure knowledge, which through this antithesis is posited as consciousness. But it is still not yet self-consciousness. It becomes actually such in the movement of this antithesis. For this antithesis is rather itself the indiscrete continuity and identity of I equals I, and each, through the very contradiction of its pure universality, which at the same time still strives against its identity with the other and cuts itself off from it, explicitly supersedes itself within its own self. Through this externalization, this knowledge which in its essence is self-discordant returns into the unity of the self. It is the actual I, the universal knowledge of itself in its absolute opposite, in the knowledge which remains internal and which on account of the purity of its separated being within self is itself completely universal. The reconciling yea in which the two I's let go of their antithetical existence is the existence of the I, which is expanded into a duality, and therein remains identical with itself, and in its complete externalization and opposite, possesses the certainty of itself. It is God manifested in the midst of those who know themselves in the form of pure knowledge. With paragraph 671, we now find ourselves at a number of different endpoints. So we can talk first about section C, conscience, the beautiful soul, evil, and its forgiveness, which is run from paragraph 632 to this last paragraph, a long section in which we've been doing a lot of things. But of course, this is part of the larger morality section of Spirit, right? And then we can talk about ending the entire portion of the work, the longest portion of the work, that is Spirit. And when we get into the religion section, we're going to see that Hegel talks about consciousness, self-consciousness, both of which were relatively short in relation to reason, which is much longer, and then spirit, which is even longer than that, as being these different threads that are being brought together in a knot. And you notice that we've covered a lot of the same ground several times, transforming it in the process. There is what Hegel calls sublation, aufheben, that is going on. And so it's not a surprise that the ending here is really bringing a lot of things together. So we should, remind ourselves of, with this paragraph, where we're starting and where we're ending, because it prepares us for the transition into the next fairly sizable section, religion. So let's actually talk about that first and think about the very last sentence of this. He tells us, it is God manifested in the midst of those who know themselves in the form of pure knowledge. So what is it? Well, all these things that we're going to talk about in just a moment. God manifested. So we've got the divine. We've got whatever the highest principle is, whatever has been running the show, you could say, whatever it is that we're trying to align ourselves with or achieve. Hegel is indeed, in his own strange way, a theist and a Christian thinker. And so this God we're going to have to figure out starting in the next section. Well, what is this God that we're talking about? It's not as if gods and conceptions of God haven't come up previously. You might think about the unhappy consciousness, where all this work is devoted to it, or the earlier parts of the spirit section where we had, gods and the divine law in relation to the law of the city and all sorts of things like that. So we've got this theological conception coming in at the end. Where does he begin this paragraph? Well, where the other paragraph leaves off, absolute spirit, right? And an absolute for Hegel means something quite important, right? You always want to have the absolute if you can. Most people in the course of the dialectic don't have the absolute, even though they think at that point in time that they are grasping the absolute. It's as if it's always, evading our grasp. And, we're getting the absolute here in this reconciliation between these two sides of consciousness that we've, essentially personified as being polarities with each other, but we could see these as within an individual or within a group. We can read this in a number of different ways. So he begins by saying it, absolute spirit, enters into existence only at that point where its pure knowledge about itself is the antithesis and alternation. Alternation there is Wechsel, exchange, the changing back and forth, so alternation is fine. And here Miller inserts, of its dual aspect, its knowledge about itself is the antithesis and alternation of itself, right? So he goes on and he says, aware that its pure knowledge is an abstract essence, absolute spirit is this conscious duty in absolute antithesis to the knowledge that is conscious of itself, qua absolute individuality of self as essence. So we got two essences here, right? Abstract essence, individuality as essence. We're going to hit on this a bit more. Both of them can be understood as beings, but they can also be understood as beings that are essential, that are important, that matter, right? That we should center our thought upon. And we have an antithesis, a contradiction between them, an opposition. So this happens through knowledge that is conscious of itself, right? And this consciousness of self is going to be central here as well. So far, so good, right? None of this should be unfamiliar to people who've traversed the Hegelian dialectic up to this point. So he goes on and then he says, the former. Okay, so what is the former? This, abstract essence, absolute spirit as conscious duty. The former is the pure continuity of the universal, which is aware that the individuality which is conscious of itself as essence is intrinsically a nullity, is evil. So let's pause on that for a moment. The universal consciousness, now we've got this reconciliation that's taken place. The side of the universal, thinking things in terms of the universal, and this could be the universal within you as you're thinking about an action that you're doing and you're like considering the sides of the action that aren't quite so savory or have bad effects. Insofar as action happens, it has to be by individuals, it has to be individuated, it has to be made real. And insofar as it's made real, wirklich, actual, it winds up being in discordance with the universal. We've seen this play itself out in many different ways, not just in the spirit section, not just in this morality section, but even in the reason section as well. So evil. Evil is individuality opposed to the universality, and opposed to the universality not merely as value, but the universality as consciousness. And we could talk here not just about simple polarities, but maybe like a spectrum, right? And you fall somewhere in that, depending on how well you're reconciled with or harmonized with or integrated into the community. So he goes on and he says, this is a pure continuity of the universal, where the individuality is evil. This, however, the individual, is the absolute discreteness, which is conscious of itself in its pure oneness as absolute. So, again, rehashing stuff. Insofar as we're acting, we have to act as individuals. If we're going to do our duties, we take upon ourselves, this is why conscience was so important, we take upon ourselves boldly or in fear and trembling this responsibility of acting. And as Hegel points out, this is a really important point for Hegel, something that often gets lost sight of in his works, that, here we go, the absolute discreteness is aware of itself as absolute, and of the universal as something unreal. Now, here's a really interesting phrase, which exists only for someone else. Who's this someone else? Well, it is also, the self, but it could be framed in a different way. The universal exists only for itself. And for another, it exists as an abstraction, as something that we don't actually have to have, as something that, once we've got the raw material of this abstraction, perhaps we could dispense with it. Perhaps it doesn't actually help us in acting. When we jump into the situation where we've got determinate circumstances, and we're going to be using this word determinate in a little bit, does the universal really help us, or is it an impediment? Is there a risk of turning into the beautiful soul that pretends that it's somehow acting by thinking or feeling or talking or ineffective willing? So this is a really important realization here, right? He goes on and he says, and here's where we have this reconciliation taking place, both aspects are purified into the unity. There's a unity going on here that we've been seeking this entire time and now is actually happening. A unity. A unity in which there's no longer in them any existence devoid of self, any negative of consciousness. Where, now this is going for both sides, on the contrary, duty is the unchanging, identical character of its self-knowledge. And now notice what he says here. Evil equally has its purpose in its being within itself and its actuality and its utterance. So what we were framing as evil before in terms of individuality, as acting, choosing imperfectly, as opposed to the universal consciousness of duty, even evil has its place within this. Yeah, and you could think about this in a number of different ways. Without evil, we couldn't have gotten to this point, right? We couldn't have gotten to the admission of evil within its own self on the part of the individual consciousness. We couldn't have gotten to the eventual forgiveness of evil by the part of the universal consciousness, which certainly took its time to do so, didn't it? Right? Evil associated with individuality, perhaps with defect, with disruption, with destruction, with malice, with selfishness. Somehow, gets integrated into this. And we could think again of that phrase that came up a few paragraphs earlier, the wounds of the spirit heal without leaving any scars. Now, this is a part of Hegel's phenomenology and other work that many people have pointed at and said, I don't know if I want to buy into this, that somehow evil can be brought into this framework. It's almost like a theodicy where everything becomes, not so bad and we don't acknowledge evil as evil. But he's not saying that. He's saying evil has its purpose, its end in being within itself and actuality in its utterance. What is the content of this utterance? The substance of its enduring existence. It is the assurance of Spirit's immanent self-certainty. Now, that's a lot of jargon there. What does he mean? The assurance of Spirit's immanent self-certainty. Whatever's happening at this stage of the dialectic is more than just an individual being evil, doing some stuff that could be good, but is actually also bad. There's something more going on here that is being taken up, that is being transformed. He goes on, and now here we get to these interesting parallels and characterizations of these two different polarities. So he says, each of these, and he calls them two self-certain spirits. So we have a Geist spirit, we have absolute spirit, right? And it's encompassing both of these and the relations between them and their consciousness of those relations, and we could go on and on and on. But we have a self-certain spirit on this side, and we also have a self-certain spirit on this side. Self-certainty, conscience, Gewissheit, right? And self-knowledge is on both of these sides, and we've achieved the point where there's a recognition, a mutual recognition, going on between the two. So it sounds like they're basically the same kind of thing, just on different sides, different polarities that are connected with each other. So he says, each of them has no other purpose than its own pure self, and no other reality and existence than just this pure self. Three important terms here: purpose, reality, existence. Now, if you've been following along, you should say to yourself, wait a second. Okay, I get that both of them have purposes, Zweck, right? Ends, goals, what they're intending, but wasn't reality and existence, Wirklichkeit, Dasein, on the side of the individual consciousness? How did universal consciousness get that? Well, for a variety of reasons. As we've seen, universal consciousness is also individuated, right? There's no individual consciousness or universal consciousness floating around out there. It's in a person who just happens to stand in for the universal, and they have a reality and they have an existence. And these are both being acknowledged now. So he says the content of this utterance, right? Each of these two self-certain spirits has no other purpose than its own pure self. And he goes on and he says, yet they are different, and the difference is absolute because it is set in this element of the pure notion. Okay, so notion, concept, Begriff, right? Each of them is different, and the difference is absolute. So they're not identical. There is mutual recognition taking place between two things that are grasping each other as same and yet different, right? And he tells us that each of these is also a specific notion or concept. He goes on here and he says, this pure notion is absolute not only for us, but for the notions themselves which stand in this antithesis, in this opposition. So there's a pure notion governing this entire thing, pure concept, that is working itself out. This is the absolute spirit, right? And it can be grasped by either side, but they also are grasping themselves as notions or concepts as well, and as being different from each other, and as being specific, Now here's where it gets really interesting, right? These are self-consciousnesses. They're not just, notions. They're not just spirit. They're self-consciousnesses. They are specific in relation to the other. So they have their, Besonderheit in their connection, in their being in connection with the other. And, this is a Gegeneinander, right? So instead of just saying in Beziehung, right, Gegeneinander, in opposition to each other, because then the antithesis is Gegensatz. So they stand in antithesis to each other. There's unity, and there's also differentiation, and there's also still being in a kind of tension, a contradiction with each other. So he goes on and he says, they are specific in relation to one another. They are at the same time in themselves universal, so that they fill out the whole range of the self. And the self has no other content than its own determinateness, which neither goes beyond the self, nor is more restricted than it. For one of them, the absolute universal, is equally the pure knowledge of itself, as the other is the absolute discreteness of individuality. Both are only this pure self-knowledge. Both of them are involved in self-knowledge, their knowledge of themselves, their knowledge of themselves in relation to the other. Their knowledge of themselves is something more because of that relation to the other. Now, when Hegel is saying that there's nothing outside of, they fill out the whole range of themselves, they don't go beyond the self, nor is more restricted than it. Okay, does this mean that we have sort of like a solipsistic conception here? No, because we have not just one individual, we have two individuals, and this can be writ large throughout a society where different people are standing in for this. And this is also a polarity within individuals, existing individuals as well, right? Now, he goes on and he says, both determinatenesses are thus pure conscious notions, whose determinateness is itself immediately a knowing, right? By being what they are, they know themselves for what they are. And then he says, or whose relationship in antithesis is the I. Now here we're getting into the third part of this paragraph. So he says, consequently, they are these sheer opposites for each other. It is the completely inner being which confronts its own self and enters into outer existence. They constitute pure knowledge, which through this antithesis is posited as consciousness. And then he says something kind of weird here, right? For something that's concluding the ending. But it is still not yet self-consciousness. It becomes actually such in the movement of this antithesis. So what is a movement of an antithesis, right? Okay, antithesis, two things are opposed to each other. They're different from each other. They're connected with each other. In this case, we have consciousnesses that are connected with each other. They are self-consciousnesses in that they're related to each other, but they're not yet realizing themselves fully as self-consciousnesses in this antithesis. The I is not yet realized as such, although, we're certainly making some progress here. He goes on, this antithesis is rather the indiscrete continuity and identity of I equals I. Now, every time that we've had an I equals I, we got something pretty abstract there, right? And Hegel says we have to have a transformation. We have to have a movement. From what? So he says, each through the very contradiction of its pure universality, which at the same time still strives against its identity with the other and cuts itself off from it. So there's still tension going on here, right? There's still opposition. Explicitly supersedes itself within its own self. So each side is superseding itself. Each side is overcoming, aufheben, right? Itself. And thereby they're doing it together, but differently. And recognition can take place. So he calls this an externalization, this knowledge which is in its existence, this knowledge which in its existence is self-discordant, returns to the unity of the self. It is the actual I, the universal knowledge of itself in its absolute opposite, in the knowledge which remains internal and which on the account of the purity of its separated being in itself is itself completely universal. the reconciling yea, affirmation, right? In which the two I's let go of their antithetical existence, is the existence of the I, which is expanded into a duality. So both of these sides are, this is part of what it means for them to supersede themselves. They are still in opposition, but that opposition is no longer something that deprives them of something. They're able to mutually recognize each other and get from the other what it is that they need, and therefore produce an affirmation. So he goes on and says, the reconciling yea, in which these two I's let go their antithetical existence, is the existence of the I, the actual I, which is expanded into a duality, therein remains identical with itself, and in its complete externalization and opposite, possesses certainty of itself. And here's where he calls this God manifested in the midst of those who know themselves in the form of pure knowledge. So we've attained something divine in the process. And now the question that we have to ask as we end this, which is going to be answered by the religion section, is not just, well, what is this divine? Can you give it some content? Can you tell me about what the hell is divine that all this back and forth stuff throughout the whole spirit section has led us into? It's also about, what am I in relation to that divine? What? Who am I? What kind of thing am I? How do I know? How do I feel? How do I connect myself to this divine? And that is where this spirit section is ending, with something, again, very abstract, not filled in. And that's where we move into the next section, which is quite a bit shorter, this religion section, right? In comparison to all the others, but there's going to be a lot of dialectical development going on there. We're getting close to the end of the work, and with this, we end the spirit section. This may, in fact, not feel entirely resolved to you, and you may be, saying, "Oh, I don't, this seems still very abstract. I'm not quite sure what's going on." That is a perfectly natural and normal reaction, I think, to what Hegel has done here. I don't know that you're meant to be satisfied reaching the end of this section. I don't know that Hegel himself was actually all that satisfied. That's why we have more going on in the two sections to come.